When the clock struck midnight, the train slowed down. But there was no station, no tracks, and no way back. The fog had come early that November night, thick and low, crawling across the tracks like a living thing, muffling the world in a grey silence that felt far too heavy for something as ordinary as a passenger. Train rolling through the flat, fields of rural Pennsylvania in 1993, where the only sounds were the steady clack of steel on steel and the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead that buzzed just slightly off rhythm like a distant electric pulse. Inside the train, a handful of passengers sat, scattered through the dimly lit cars, elderly couple whispering softly to each other, a businessman sleeping with his head against the window, a young woman reading a paperback horror novel, and at the far end of the third gare, the conductor, Thomas Reed, sat sipping lukewarm coffee from a chipped metal mug, his reflection ghostly in the dark window beside him. It was a quiet shift, almost too quiet. And Thomas found himself thinking about his wife, about the dinner he'd missed, about the strange static he'd heard on the radio earlier that evening, a garbled voice repeating something that almost sounded like, "Don't stop, keep moving," before the line went dead. He hadn't thought much of it at the time. Trains picked up weird signals all the time, but now, as the fog swallowed the moonlight and the landscape beyond the window turned to an endless sea of white, a tightness settled in his chest that he couldn't explain. Around midnight, the train entered a long stretch of forest, miles of pines that loomed like dark pillars against the mist, and that was when he saw it, a figure standing by the tracks, visible only for a second as the train swept past. Tall and still, wearing what looked like an old black coat. Thomas blinked, leaned closer to the glass, but the fog had already swallowed everything again. A trick of the light, he told himself. Just fog and fatigue. But a few minutes later, when he walked through the cars to check tickets, he stopped cold. Seat 22B, near the back. A man was sitting there who hadn't been there before. He was dressed exactly like the figure Thomas had glimpsed outside. Black coat, brimmed hat, gloves, posture stiff and deliberate. The man didn't look up as Thomas approached. His head was bowed slightly, hands folded on his lap as though in prayer. "Evening, sir," Thomas said, trying for professional calm. "Ticket, please?" The man didn't move. For a moment, Thomas thought he hadn't heard. But then, without lifting his head, the stranger said in a low voice, "Already paid." Something in the tone made Thomas's skin crawl, flat, toneless, like a voice remembered from a dream. "All right then," Thomas muttered, moving on, but as he passed the seat, he noticed a strange odor, faint and metallic, like wet iron. The air around the man felt colder too, as though the train's heating system had skipped that single
square of space. He wanted to tell himself it was nothing, but as the train rattled deeper into the woods, passengers began to grow uneasy. The elderly woman clutched her husband's hand and whispered that she felt someone breathing behind her, though there was no one there. The young woman closed her book. Frowning, she swore she'd seen movement in the reflection of the window, a shape standing behind her seat, though the aisle was empty. Even the businessman stirred from his sleep, mumbling about hearing footsteps on the roof. Thomas checked the control panel. All systems normal, speed steady. Yet the fog outside had thickened, so much now that the world beyond the windows had vanished entirely. The headlights cut through nothing but gray, and the radio crackled again, that same static voice muttering a phrase too faint to catch. Then, just as the clock in the cabin ticked to 12:01, the train jolted, lights flickering once, twice, before stabilizing in a dim orange glow. Somewhere in the distance, a door slammed, though no one had moved between cars. Thomas grabbed his flashlight and started down the aisle again, his boots echoing in the unnatural quiet. Every face he passed looked pale and tight with tension. When he reached seat 22B, the man in black was gone. The seat cushion still bore the shape of a body, the faint imprint of weight, but the man himself had vanished. Thomas checked the adjoining cars, nothing. Then he noticed something else. Condensation blooming across the windows, though the heating was on full. When he reached out to wipe it away, his fingers came back slick with something thicker than water. Dark, faintly red in the emergency glow. A sound rose from behind him, soft at first, like distant whispering, growing clearer with each passing second until he could make out words. "Next stop, Ashbury." That was impossible. Ashbury Station had been closed since 1974, after the derailment that had killed everyone aboard Train 113. The company had demolished the platform years ago. He turned toward the sound, and standing at the far end of the car was the man in black, motionless, eyes glinting pale in the dim light. The train's wheels screamed against the track. Slowing though, no one had touched the brakes. Thomas shouted for everyone to stay seated, but the passengers were already panicking, some rushing toward the doors, others frozen in their seats. The man in black began walking forward, slowly, deliberately, and as he did, the lights flickered again, plunging the car into alternating bands of light and dark. Each time the bulbs flashed back on, he was closer. Thomas backed away, tripping over a fallen briefcase, the flashlight rolling from his hand and spinning light wildly across the floor. In its beam, he saw something that made his breath catch. Footprints forming on the metal floor, wet and dark, appearing one by one, leading straight to him. When the stranger spoke again, his voice seemed to echo from everywhere.
Coming from the vents, the windows, even the static of the intercom. "You missed your stop, conductor," he said, and the lights went out entirely. The train groaned like a dying animal. Metal shrieked. The sound of wind howled through the darkness, though every window was sealed. Thomas stumbled toward the control car, but the hallway felt longer than it should have been, stretching into an impossible distance. The red emergency light pulsed faintly at the far end like a heartbeat. Somewhere behind him, a scream ripped through the dark. Then another, cut off mid-breath. He didn't turn back. When he finally reached the control room, the radio was alive again, whispering fragments of words. "Boarded. Can't leave. Ashbury." He slammed the brake lever down, but nothing happened. The speedometer needle was spinning wildly now, and yet, looking out the windshield, there was no track ahead, just endless fog, glowing faintly from within, as though something vast and unseen was moving beneath it. Then, slowly, the shape of a platform emerged. A station, lights flickering weakly under layers of grime. The sign read, "Ashbury," in faded white paint. The train hissed to a halt, though Thomas had done nothing. He stood frozen, heart pounding, as the doors opened with a long, wheezing sigh. Cold air poured in, thick with the scent of rust and earth. Outside, the platform was covered in moss. The ticket booth collapsed. The clock stopped forever at 12:05, and standing there, waiting, were dozens of figures, silent and pale, their faces shadowed beneath wide-brimmed hats, coats dark with moisture. Thomas tried to back away, but his legs wouldn't move. One by one, the passengers began to rise. Eyes glassy, movements stiff, as though pulled by invisible strings. They filed off the train without a word, disappearing into the fog beyond the platform. When the last of them had gone, Thomas turned to find the man in black standing in the doorway, watching him. "End of the line," the man said softly and smiled. Thomas stepped backward, his foot catching on the threshold, and then the world seemed to tilt. The sound of the train changed, the air itself humming as though charged with electricity. And for a heartbeat, everything went perfectly silent. When sound returned, it was the sound of nothing but wind and the distant call of a nightbird. The train was gone. Days later, the dispatcher at Oak Hollow station reported hearing a transmission on the old analog frequency. "I found Turtam." Train 113 calling in, requesting clearance for Ashbury. The timestamp read 12:06 AM. The dispatcher laughed it off until the second voice came through, calm, quiet, unmistakably Thomas Reed's, saying, "All passengers accounted for." They sent a search team along the route the next morning, but the tracks near Hollow Bend were covered in frost, though the rest of the valley was warm. The team found one thing at the edge of the forest: a single conductor's cap,
soaked with dew, resting beside a rusted mile marker that read 113, and though no trains have run that line in decades, sometimes on nights when the fog rolls thick over the hills, you can still hear it, the low moan of a whistle in the distance, the faint rattle of wheels on empty rails. And if you listen closely enough, a voice carried on the wind whispering, "Next stop, Ashbury."